Good afternoon all. Welcome to the next instalment of business support webinars from Westminster Business Council. My name is Sophie Shrubsole and I'm one of the team here at WBC. I'm delighted that we're joined by Owen Morgan of Into today. Into provides people-centric outplacement and career transition, coaching, mentoring and change management services. Now, today we are going to be discussing a really difficult subject, that of redundancy, and how you communicate those difficult messages and have those conversations with team members. No one relishes having these conversations, but what Owen and I hope you take from today is having a little more confidence about how to go about it and understanding some of the aspects that you need to think about when you go in to have those conversations. Now, before we start officially, I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about Westminster Business Council for any of those of you on the call that have not attended one of these sessions before. WBC is London's premier business connections network. We help businesses grow across the capital by providing effective business intelligence and contacts. Our events programme and introduction service helps businesses to develop their client base. And we're also very proud of our work to connect business to the local community. We've provided hundreds of opportunities for students to access work experience and job opportunities, and we've supported many charities and ensured people work together for the wider benefit of the City of Westminster. Now we're just going to wait a moment more for people to log on and get used to the system. But hello to everyone that is already with us. Thank you for being with us today. Just a few housekeeping rules. Everyone is automatically on mute, but as we go through the discussion, if you'd like to ask questions of Owen, please do use the Q&A functionality, and I will read those questions out for you at the end of the presentation. I'm not going to make any reference to your name or your business, so please feel free to ask any questions that you so desire. If you've got a live situation in your business that you want to talk through with Owen, we'll make sure that you're connected with him after this webinar so that you can have that confidential and supportive conversation around this subject matter. So we've got a few people on with us, and I think we're just about ready to start now. We're a few moments after 3. So I'm going to hand over to Owen, who's going to take us through his presentation, and at the end of that, Owen and I should pop up on your screens with our webcams and we'll start that Q&A. But as we go through, if you've got anything you want to pop into that question box, please feel free to, and we'll get to them at the end. So Owen, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, and welcome everyone, and pleased to be able to give you a bit of an overview, I guess from my experience or our experience as a business around how best to structure what is clearly a very difficult conversation. So let me just whip through the slides here. I'm not going to spend too long on the slides. They are a little bit text heavy, if I'm honest, but I'll talk about them in the round. And my view is always to sort of have that sort of Q&A at the end in order to get the best out of the session. So very happy to take questions at the end, as Sophie has indicated. So let's quickly run through these slides. Let's see if I can get them to move through. So as Sophie said, we're an HR consulting business, a range of different activities. Circles 4 and 1 on that right-hand column are typically the areas where we tend to focus our activities. And unfortunately in one sense, outplacement is come to the fore. And my view in that with outplacement is there's an inevitability around job loss and change. And as someone who has been in that situation and has benefited personally from outplacement, I'm a real evangelist around how important it is to offer some type of support to individuals as they leave an organisation. It's a difficult world out there at the moment, and as we all know, is becoming increasingly difficult by the day. So helping people into what is an increasingly difficult job market, I think is key to all our successes, and indeed I think it's the right thing to do. So happy to talk about outplacement as we move forward. I guess you don't need me to talk to you about the difficulties that we've had overall since since COVID really took a hold, I guess way back in sort of February, March time. We know that some of the stats are fairly stark. We know that the number of individual workers on payroll has dropped significantly. I could probably update that first bullet point there, that 695,000 stat daily, and unfortunately at the moment it's only going in one direction. So testing times, very difficult for individuals, as we've seen through various news channels. We know that UK redundancies are rising at their fastest rate since the financial crisis 10 or 12 years ago now. And of course it affects all organisations, small SMEs right the way through to FTSE 100 giants. And I think part of the challenge that we have here is that given we've not really been in an economic recession for the last 10 or 12 years, when organisations go through redundancy exercises, many of the individual managers or HR teams that are actually sort of putting together these processes have never done it before, and it's a daunting time. It's a daunting time to try and ensure that the level of human contact is appropriate. We're making sure we're talking to our colleagues and our friends here in some cases, but equally making sure that there's the legal and sort of professional elements and the aspects around that process are adhered to. So a difficult time, and finding that balance between, as I say, being empathetic and personal at the same time as being clear on process is absolutely key here. So when we look at redundancy, I guess most individuals always think it focuses on the employee, but of course it's a broader suite of activities here. So the employee clearly is the individual that feels it most. The manager is critical in delivering that news and formulating subsequent plans to move the business forward. And organisationally, of course, from a structural perspective, organisations will have their own agendas around where they want to go and what type of support they can provide to individuals, and equally what type of organisation they want to be moving forward. So it really does. It impacts the entire structure of an organisation. Employees at all levels are impacted, and whether or not they are unfortunately in that position of being made redundant, individual employees, managers, and as I say, other stakeholders within the organisation will all feel the impact of redundancy. So we're going to look at the objectives, I guess, that each of those aspects of each of those categories is focused on. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but fundamentally, from an individual perspective, we want our individual workers to be supported. We want them to be informed and treated with respect. All of us, I'm sure, if we were in that position, would want the same outcomes. From a manager perspective, well, we want our managers and our leaders, our sort of line management community, effectively, to be well briefed and to be able to communicate effectively to those that have been impacted, and that's an art. Communication and making sure that you hit the right tone is an art. Some people are naturally gifted at that art. Others need to practice. But actually, if you practice, you can get to a stage where you can deliver that message comprehensively, succinctly, and with a degree of empathy. And again, of course, the middle circle there informs the circle on the left. So if you get that middle piece right, generally the person who is receiving the news will feel supported, informed, and treated with a degree of dignity and respect. From an organisation perspective, well, of course, the organisation wants to achieve its outcomes. Many outplacements or change programs I've been involved with over the past have been sort of long in the planning. Organisations are, in general terms, able to sort of take a longer-term view than has been the case in this current sort of economic scenario. So I think from a planning perspective, it is more difficult, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And again, we'll talk about what those three elements need to look at to achieve the objectives in a fluid and clear and straightforward and compassionate way to end up with a good outcome for all. When we talk about planning the redundancy process, again, those three elements combine in various ways to give us the outcome that we're after. So, of course, from an organisational perspective, the organisation looks at its strategy and its objectives. It has to plan carefully and cautiously with regards to what unfortunately is an ever-changing backdrop. I've been speaking to a number of organisations recently who have had plans that have only recently been signed off at a board level, completely turned upside down as a result of COVID. I think the government are at a bit of a fix at the moment. In some cases, depending on who you speak to, it's very difficult for them to second guess how the COVID virus is spreading, and of course they have to be agile in their thinking, and as organisations we have to be agile in terms of how we respond to that. So making sure as clearly as it's possible that sort of planning stage is effective, and I guess in this case we have to assume that we are dealing with some degree of certainty. Once the planning stage is agreed, then people move forward into this sort of consultation phase. So we move from a thinking, strategizing area through into a doing phase. And that consultation phase, again, for anyone that's been involved in redundancy specifically, is all around looking at the what ifs. So it's around potentially challenging and providing a different opinion on some of the plans that have been put forward. So, genuinely organizations have a legal requirement to consult. In some cases, that consultation can lead them off into different routes that they may or may not have considered. And in some cases, that can obviate the need for redundancy. So that's a great outcome if you're able to consult with your leaders, provide some additional information, and get to a stage where the organisation achieves its objectives, but doesn't actually have to let people go. So again, having that sort of brainstorm activity, that challenge, that conceptualising stage is important. Once that's completed, we move into this communication phase. And if there's one word I think would characterise how successful the whole redundancy process would be communication. So effective communication, I think, really allows us to provide some real clarity to individuals. And at a time of uncertainty, clarity is what people are after primarily. So it is important to cover those steps. In some cases, we're not necessarily given the benefit of time, so we're only able to cover those steps briefly. But it really does help to give a broader and a deeper understanding around how the process has evolved. And again, that will help when you come to sit down with an individual prior to, unfortunately, having to give them the bad news around redundancy. When we've gone through that process, we then have to think about actually breaking the news. So this is the nub of the presentation. And again, I've seen many organisations do this really well over the years I've been involved in the space. Equally, I've seen other organisations do it pretty poorly. Preparation is key. A little bit of forethought, can really help make this an effective activity. And again, making sure that you think about timing. So trying to avoid birthdays, for example, trying to avoid days where individuals are, potentially under some emotional stress. I mean, someone said to me recently they've avoided letting people go simply because they've just come off of a bereavement period of leave, and that's the right thing to do. It may be more difficult from an organisational perspective to wait another couple of weeks, but from a personal perspective, it's the right thing to do. So thinking about timings, I think, is important. Thinking about the day of the week. I always say to organisations, never let people go on a Friday, because they tend to go back home. They've got no one to talk to in some cases, and they stew on that news over the weekend. And they come into work on a Monday, having constructed a sort of an outline of events that is so far away from reality in some cases that it's an unhelpful position from which to pick up the conversation. So earlier in the week I always think is better. Mondays, Tuesdays, or Wednesdays. People can then think about things overnight, potentially talk about it with their significant other or their family or friends, and then get to a stage where they're able to bring that conversation back into work on the Thursday and Friday, rather than having that sort of elongated period of time over a weekend through which to go through all sorts of thought patterns, many of which are probably likely to be quite unhelpful. When individuals are brought in to have that conversation with a line manager, and typically someone from HR is sitting there, it's useful to do it in a quiet room away from that whole corridor traffic piece. No one wants to be sitting in a room with the world and his wife walking past outside, particularly as there will be some emotional element to it in most cases, even if that's only fairly short-lived. So trying to give people that opportunity to sit quietly in a room, no disruptions. Make sure that people are aware of what's going on as far as possible, and people are given space, and that way the communication can be undertaken fairly, without interruption, and people can be provided with that opportunity to question HR and indeed the line manager along the points that they might want to think about. It's worth also, before going into the room and talking to someone around the likelihood of redundancy, whether that's confirmed or whether that's simply a case of going into consultation, it's worth understanding whether that individual is going through any employment issues. So again, from a tribunal perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, I hasten to add, from a tribunal perspective, it's always worthwhile ensuring that nothing potentially could be conceived as getting in the way or indeed unduly influencing the redundancy notification. So, for example, if someone has issued a grievance to a line manager, for example, or another member of staff, it's probably best to try and address that issue first and then move to address the issue around redundancy. Trying to do them at the same time is possible, and there's certainly no law against it, but it's more difficult, and the two can quite easily get confused and cross over into each other, which again is unhelpful. Many organizations say, well, do I need HR to be on hand? My view would always be yes. If you do have an HR person who is able to support, particularly if you have a line manager who has not undertaken this activity beforehand, it can be very useful. And HR should be there to support. Of course, it becomes very daunting when someone walks into a room and they see someone from HR behind the table, and indeed they see their line manager. If they haven't been alerted to the fact about what's going on, that's often the first step and the first challenge that people will face. Nevertheless, HR I think is always important, and certainly if you have an internal HR team, I would strongly suggest that they're available and on hand if required. This last point, again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a few minutes, but have a clear understanding about what you're going to say. Many individuals seem to try and make it up on the hoof, and there's this bravado in some cases that I've seen with line managers saying, no problem at all, I'll be able to cope with this. They then have an individual in front of them to whom they're having to give some very difficult and challenging news, and they go off script. So when I mean off script, I guess examples, there would be things like, it wouldn't have been my choice, it's someone else. So you're abrogating responsibility for the action, or you try and minimize the impact. So you might say something like, oh, don't get me wrong, I'm sure it won't happen, or I'm sure it'll be a more positive outcome. Offering that sort of false optimism is unhelpful, because unfortunately people do cling to it, and when reality bites, that can be even more of a drop in terms of how far they have to fall in some cases. So agree a script in advance, learn it, make sure you're familiar with it. What we're trying to avoid is reading a script off the page. You don't want to come across as an automaton. You're dealing with your individual colleagues, friends in some cases, team members that you've developed over the course of a few years in many instances. So they are individuals who you've been working closely with for many months and years in some cases. Treat them as such, and make sure that you do have that sort of element of sort of personality into the conversation. It's got to be a sober conversation. There's no getting around that, but it can be one that's a relatively warm and empathetic conversation. You've got to understand how individuals are feeling. If we look at things in a bit more detail, my view is always there's three specific elements to the conversation. So setting the scene, which is what we've pretty much talked about. Come and talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's what it means for the individual, and then what the next steps are around the process. So if we just briefly open some of these up a little bit, from a setting the scene perspective, it's all about why is this happening? And again, it's an important element of a conversation to discuss in a redundancy process, because many people won't be aware of some of the challenges that the organisation is facing. They'll be aware that those redundancies are redundancy may well be a word that's been floated around. People may come to the meeting with a skewed view of why they're there. They may not realise it's impacting directly upon them. So giving them a little bit of time to understand the background around why this has happened is important. So typically at the moment it's COVID. Clearly COVID has caused organizations to close their doors in some cases. Therefore, no money's coming into the business. Therefore, the fixed costs have to be paid, and unfortunately, some of the variable costs around people in some instances. And it's I don't like referring to people as variable costs necessarily, but some of those variable costs need to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, then the business goes out of business, which clearly is something that we need to avoid. Many organisations have many other drivers around why that change is necessary, and indeed why the need for redundancies is necessary. So others could be simply a move overseas. Organisations can get to a stage where they decide that they can source cheaper goods or indeed services overseas. We've seen that clearly over the last sort of 10 or 20 years with regards to call centres. And therefore, it's slicker, more efficient, and best business practice to offshore some of the activities. A lot of organizations go through mergers and acquisitions, and again, through no fault of their own, people who have been working in a highly successful business suddenly find that business acquired, and as a result, there are 2 marketing functions, 2 finance functions, 2 operational functions, and of course, there needs to be some rationalization there. So that's a difficult time for people, particularly because they do tend to link their own personal performance with redundancy. I mean, the stigma around redundancy that was probably around in the 70s and the 80s is long gone. I think it's now certainly part and parcel of what most people would expect as would expect to experience at least one time, probably 2 or 3 times in their working careers. But nonetheless, it's not an easy thing to deal with. We often say that redundancy is probably only it's akin to the really big stresses in life. So bereavement, divorce, buying a house, some of those really big issues. Redundancy certainly sits alongside those elements, and for certain people can be really difficult. So helping them understand why it's taking place is important. If we move on to what it means for the individual, well, unfortunately, their role is either at risk of redundancy, during which time the consultation piece takes place, or, and let's use this for the sake of example, their role has been made redundant. And again, it's important to stress that it's their role that's been made redundant, not the individual. So again, many people confuse that issue. The role is redundant, it's not the individual. So of course the individual ends up being impacted, but it's the role that has gone. And again, it's important to ensure that people understand that, because they will ask, well, why me and not not Bob, or why me, not other members of my team. So making sure organizations are very clear about why certain roles have been impacted and not others is important. And again, I'm pretty sure there will be conversations that flow from that. So people will ask, for example, what does it mean for my team? If I'm the team leader and suddenly I'm moving on, what does it mean for my team? How will they be supported? Who will do the work? Lots of questions that you need to have answers for in order to explain why, as an organization, the company's gone through a strategic process and determined that certain roles can be dispensed with. And again, I'm using language that's very direct here. You have to modify your language appropriately when you're speaking to individuals in this situation. A bit of sensitivity goes a long way, I think. I think people will reflect, so it's important to give them some time. And again, that's one of my reasons to say, look, once you've had a conversation with someone and you've told them about redundancy, they will be shocked. They will demonstrate a range of emotions, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But what will almost certainly happen is people will want to go away, think about it, mull it over for a couple of days, and then come back to the situation or to the company to sort of further question other issues around the redundancy process. So allowing time for people, I think, is important. I always balk a little bit when I hear organisations having to notify people on a Friday, notifying people on a Thursday, let them go on a Friday, and that's it. I think that's inviting trouble. I think you tend to get a higher incidence of tribunals there because people feel that process hasn't taken place, or they've not been given sufficient time to address their needs. It is possible to do that, but it's certainly not advisable. So then we move into the final phase. Just briefly, it's very useful to have copies of everything that's been discussed. So things like notice periods, any redundancy payments, any internal support that's been signposted. So that could be internal HR support or indeed some sort of outplacement service. People don't tend to listen. There's a lot to take on. And at the end of the meeting, people will get to a stage where they've only probably captured 30 or 40% of what's been said to them. So giving them appropriate paperwork, reinforces the message and maybe allows them to reflect on things that were discussed in the meeting, but not necessarily didn't necessarily resonate at the time. So helping them understand what support is available, for example, or what their notice period is, or when they might be expected to leave, what their statutory payments might be, so on and so forth, I think is very important. And again, on a final point there, again, organizations typically allocate around half an hour for that redundancy process, and in most cases that's perfectly adequate. It needs to be business-like, it needs to be formal with that degree of sensitivity. You need to run through that script, you need to get to the stage where you address all those points, and typically that takes about half an hour, 40 minutes. In some cases, for people who have been significantly emotionally impacted, or indeed individuals who have many more questions than might have been first envisaged, it's important to not rush them out the door. The HR person or indeed the line manager should remain available to talk to that individual about any questions or thoughts they might have. And again, that's important. You don't want to be treating people as if they're on a production line here. Just briefly, again, I think I've covered most of these points. Keep it simple. Try not to use overcomplicated messaging. I once sat in on an individual line manager who talked about liquidity gearing ratios as a reason why a secretarial or an administrative individual was being let go, and you could see straight away, this individual had they'd lost interest or indeed an understanding about what was being communicated to them. So got to keep it simple, got to keep it relevant, got to keep it focused on the individual. You'll have to prepare for some difficult responses. There will be some. Some individuals react with anger. Some individuals are generally confused, and of course you need to take care of them from a well-being viewpoint. I mean, I've seen organisations lay on taxis in the past, or have someone drive them home, drive the individual that's been impacted home afterwards. You don't want someone who is tearful, for example, jumping into a car and driving 20 minutes around the M25. It's not sensible, and it's certainly not something that we would wish to see anyone undergo. Listen, make sure that, as I say, you listen to some of their comments and some of their feedback. There will be plenty. Some people possibly won't give you that opportunity to respond to their thoughts until they've had some time to reflect and think about different things. But being an employer that listens, I think, is important. Pieces around show compassion I've talked about. That's clearly key. I've talked about not offering false optimism, so be realistic. Once that communication, once that message has taken place, it's pretty much set in stone. Certainly, if it's at the notice of redundancy stage, if it's not at the consultation stage. But once notice of redundancy is given, then it's unfortunately it's very difficult then to sort of change that around if everything else stays the same. Signpost support, this is where EAP support, for example, employee assistance programs, can be hugely beneficial. Outplacement businesses. I mean, we work with organisations, and part of their reason for working with us is simply to get people focused on the future. They don't want people being sort of overly critical and sort of shouting from the sidelines, as it were. They want us to help people, get them into a mindset to focus on their future. That's one aspect of outplacement. There are clearly many others. And you need to be visible and available. No one likes to get to a stage where an organisation communicates some bad news and then sort of shuts up shop. So, making sure that you are seen as visible and available to people, I think, again, is key, because whilst you may not have the answer, you need to be able to speak to people that do. And again, that avoids 2 + 2 = 53, and unfortunately, coffee machine conversations, situations where rumor and hearsay become fact and receive wisdom are all too common in this situation. So making sure that a line manager community is available, I think, is important as well. Moving on to the next one, I popped that in there simply because I think it's such an important element of this whole process. We are communicating. It's a difficult message, but communication is absolutely key. And for anyone that hasn't heard of James Humes, he's a presidential speechwriter. I think he's probably knocking on a bit now. He's probably into his 80s, if not 90s, but he was responsible for many of the famous presidents of the US in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and some of their speeches. It's great orators and individuals that took a huge boost from some of his words. I talked briefly around emotions to change or reactions to change, and I've popped this slide in towards the end of my presentation, just to give you a little bit of an insight into what is a typical reaction to any change. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is the Kubler-Ross change slide. So it's a slide that's used, or a graph that's used in many forms of counselling. So in bereavement, in many aspects around a change in scenarios, change in circumstances, divorce, for example, job loss, it's commonly used. We often find that people go through these emotions in sequence. Some people will have higher highs and lower lows than others. Some people will move through the time frame very, very quickly. But typically, most people, even if they've been expecting to hear news of redundancy, for example, once it's written down on a piece of paper, once you've had that conversation with an HR or a line manager, 9 times out of 10 people are quite shocked about that. It's the immediacy of that situation. It's the fact that it's now happened. It's become real. So it's moved away from sort of speculation, I may be made redundant, to goodness me, I have been made redundant. And people, no matter how well they're built, will often get to a stage where they feel shocked as a result of that news. You might say, well, actually, why does shock appear on an upward curve? And actually, people, whilst they are shocked, they actually feel, there's been many studies that talk about how individuals feel a sense of positivity and relief about hearing some clarity and some news, and that's what that element tends to sort of look at. Okay, people are always shocked at the news, but actually, because it provides clarity, because it provides fact, there is a degree of relief, and actually their morale increases a little bit, their mood lifts. They've got something certain to work around. Having said that, that is very, very quickly followed by this sort of drop down into the trough down here. So people after they've overcome that initial shock say, well, goodness me, I can't believe this is happening to me. People get frustrated. They, in some cases, move down into some sort of depressive episodes, which is clearly very challenging. Our role as leaders is to try and move people through this change curve as quickly as possible. We want them to get back up to this sort of experimental decision-making integration elements, or integration emotions, where they're accepting of the change. They've now decided that okay, they'll close that door, but actually many other doors remain to be opened, and now's the time to potentially look at different alternatives. So again, as outplacement consultants, we deal with this quite extensively, helping people move on from a difficult part of their career journey into a stage where they're more focused around looking at future career steps. I often say to people, if an individual worker has enjoyed their time at an organization, maybe they've been there 5, 6, 7, 10 years, that's the bit they should focus on, rather than what is a very, very difficult 2 or 3 week period, possibly either side of the point at which their job has gone. Unfortunately, that's not often the case, and certainly handled badly, despite having 7 or 8 good years of enjoyable work in an organization, people tend to remember the 3 or 4 bad weeks of how that redundancy was handled. So anything you can do to mitigate that, I think, is a positive step. Reactions to change. I guess I've probably cast a more of a downbeat view on redundancy, and I guess most people wouldn't welcome it, certainly in these current times. There are people that jump for joy. So it's important to remember that one change event can have different reactions. So for every individual that sees it as a threat, or they become negative around that outcome, or they become fearful, there are other people, we often refer to them as glass half full people, who become energized. They see a real opportunity to get out of a rut. And again, it's a very difficult element to sort of capture. But in some cases, people do look back and say, well, you know what, I was made redundant from XYZ company, and actually that was the best thing that could ever happen to me. It wasn't at the time. It was a horrible sense of foreboding. I was looking at a job market that was more challenging, but actually I've now got on a better path in terms of my career. I've really thought about what I want to do, and I've managed to sort of get out of a rut. So change is personal, and I think we should never forget that. I've been in many organizations where the leader has had a sort of a town hall meeting at the front of the audience, and they've outlined, with a degree of caution and concern, genuine concern, what will have to happen to the business for it to move forward. And equally, there's people in the back row sort of pulling out their calculators, thinking, well, goodness me, I've been here 24 years, and they're typing, they're sort of looking at all their sort of permutations around redundancy payments, and you can see the smiles starting to appear on people's faces. That's one extreme. Clearly, other individuals take it much more to heart, and it becomes not something to be welcomed, but something to be feared. So people are on both sides of the spectrum there, and again, it's important to think about that, I think, when we go through change. This is my last slide here, and I guess I use this one simply to demonstrate the fact that it can be a very uncertain time. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the phrase VUCA leadership. It's been around for a few years now. Essentially, it's the art of leading teams in volatile, unstable, complex, and ambiguous environments. And I guess we all know that the world of work is changing rapidly at the moment. It's a 2020 type issue, but when we add the overlay of COVID-19 on top of it, it becomes more challenging. It's an extra dimension to add to an already complex problem. So you often find people in this sort of vortex where things are spinning around at pace, and people are looking for some form of stability. So the little people in the white paper boats there are trying to provide that sort of stability to people, and it is possible. It is possible to get to a stage where, despite it being very challenging, it's possible to provide some form of clarity for people in very, very challenging times. Should you be interested, we have a downloadable guide on our website. The link is at the bottom there, and that provides, I guess, some additional information around managing the redundancy process. So, as I say, I'm not a lawyer. I think sometimes it's always important to get some proper legal advice with these activities. There's a good way to do it from a managerial perspective, from an organizational perspective, and if you can combine the two, and you can get that clarity from a legal perspective, but actually you can get individual line managers to understand the steps and the processes and the hints and the tips that they might want to take to make it as easy a process as possible. That can be hugely beneficial when it comes to sitting down in front of someone. So that's it from me. As Sophie said, happy to take questions and talk a little bit more about what we do, if that is relevant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Owen, for that. It was really, really helpful, and some very practical tips as well. We've had a few questions come in, so I'm going to read those off to you. So some people in businesses will be highly tuned into what's going on around them. Others may not be, although you'd hope most people are with COVID and everything that's going on. How do you set the scene and provide that context as to what a business is going through without terrifying everybody that all of their jobs might be up for grabs, so to speak?
Sure. No, it's a very valid question. I mean, again, I think transparency is something that some organizations are naturally good at. They have a real clarity of conversation with their teams. Others less so, and I'd encourage organizations as far as possible, and in some cases it's not always possible, to be as open and honest with their teams as possible. and that may well be examples around, quarterly updates, just to ensure people are aware of the direction of travel. This type of activity should never come as a surprise to people. And I think sometimes, if it does come as a bolt from the blue, if the overriding message or the overriding communication has been upbeat and positive, and then suddenly out of the blue there's notifications of widespread redundancies, I think that makes those redundancies more challenging, and it's you're likely then to see higher incidences of things like tribunals, higher incidences of mental illness and mental health challenges. People make more use of EAP systems at that point, and it's largely because they can't correlate the two ends of the spectrum. On one hand, they're being told things are going well, the company's doing very well, and the next stage they're being told, "Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, your job's at risk." So making sure that, as I say, as far as possible, there is that degree of clarity, and that organisations are as open, as honest as possible. If there are some challenging times, then tell people there are some challenging times. Tell people there are sales are down, and that you often find that organisations that go through that never get to a point at which they end up having to let people go, simply because people double their efforts in some cases. So I'm a great believer in being honest with people, and not trying to sort of put in place a message that's not aligned with the reality of the situation.
Yeah, very good advice, and probably something that businesses can do in the good times as well, just to keep that continuity and get teams together as well. One of the things I was interested in you saying is that you've witnessed some really bad handling of these situations. I wonder if you could give us a few examples of really big no-nos, things that people should definitely avoid doing.
Big no-nos, yeah, certainly. I mean, I think some of these I'm pretty sure have been sort of well trotted out over the years, but organizations continue to do it. So texting people to let them know they're redundant, what a horrible way to receive that type of news. Certainly a big no-no. I mean, I've heard of organizations taking groups of individuals to two different hotels. So the people that are going to be retained by the business go to the nice plush hotel. The people, unfortunately, they're going to be moved on and let go, end up going to sort of the grotty hotel around the corner, and wholly inappropriate. Individuals in some cases who are unprepared. I mean, it's more difficult at the moment to give notice to people over the Zoom and Skype and indeed Teams channels, but it's possible. And again, preparation is key. There was a situation, I think, fairly recently with an American business who put in place a poor, clearly unprepared HR leader to communicate notice of redundancy to 40 or 50, sorry, 400 or 500 people globally. Now, it was very evident that she wasn't given adequate preparation, and as a result of that, the message came across in a very stumbling fashion. She wasn't sure of her facts. She wasn't sure of different locations and their overriding sort of national law. Certainly not a way to do that. Definitely something to try and avoid. There is a way to do this, making sure that people are clear and sure of their facts. I think it goes a long way to do it. But as I say, going back to your point around poor ways to do it, I mean, there are so many where people don't necessarily pick up the advice that's or the practice that's often seen as best practice. They try and sort of shortcut the service, or they do it on the hoof, and in some cases it can have devastating outcomes for people. And if not a devastating outcome, it will certainly lead to a higher preponderance of negative glass door reviews in some cases. And in this world of unlimited connectivity, you want to try and demonstrate that your business, and potentially your business, hopefully will go from strength to strength at some point, and it'll hire people in the future. You don't want it to be sort of dragged through the mud and seen as a negative employer, or an employer that handles redundancy badly.
Yeah, absolutely. On that very first note, questions come in. Is it acceptable to do this process via Zoom?
Yes, absolutely. It adds an extra dimension of difficulty, but again, I think in these current situations, in these current times, if it's handled well and it's properly prepared, yes, absolutely. I think people will understand that they can't necessarily meet face to face. That's is clearly always the preference. But in some cases, if people are remote and possibly they're shielding or they're having to be they're working in lockdown areas, then yes, I mean it's possible to do it. The steps are the same. As I say, it's not ideal, but it's certainly something that can be done with a degree of forethought.
Excellent. Okay. And when it comes to some M&A activity and companies obviously acquiring, can you give some advice on how you should communicate redundancies with that newly acquired business?
That's quite a tricky one, really, because generally organisations that have been acquired, you'd hope that they are a successful organisation. That's probably one of the reasons they've been acquired. They've been doing well, and a competitor potentially has come across them and thought they'd make a great addition to my business. So organisations, it's clearly not always the case, but organisations that have done well and have found themselves the subject of an acquisition, I mean, the same rules apply in many senses. What you're trying to do when you bring two businesses together is to get the best of both worlds. So again, I've often seen organisations when large competitor acquires a smaller organisation, all the roles stay within the large competitor, and unfortunately, that tends to really undermine the expectations of the workers within the smaller competitor. You've bought their skills. In some cases, you really do need to try and ensure that there's an adequate process in place to ensure that individuals from both companies potentially have a fair crack of the whip in terms of what the new structure is going to look like. I once worked for an oil industry in the oil industry. I once worked for an organisation that went through a series of takeovers, and I recall the corporate colours were still in use, probably 3 or 4 years down the line. So I used to work for an organisation that had a primarily orange corporate brand identity. That merged with an organisation that had a primarily blue corporate identity. And then those two organisations merged with an organisation that had a primarily black corporate identity. And 3 or 4 years down the line, people were still saying, well, I used to work in the blue team, or I used to work in the black team, or I used to work in the orange team. And I remember going back into that organisation thinking, you know what, they've failed to capitalise on the real strength and successes of these various businesses that have come together as one, because people still see themselves as rooted in the past, as opposed to actually, we're now working for this new entity. So I think when organisations do go through M&A activity, making sure individuals and skills and roles are not necessarily apportioned evenly between two communities. That may well not be the case, but people need to feel they belong to that new business. And if unfortunately organisations have to go through a restructure, again, it needs to be done fairly, it needs to be done openly, it needs to be done in a transparent fashion. So making sure there's opportunity for people to feel they've been able to sort of contribute, as opposed to they've simply been seen as an additional on cost that an organisation wants to get rid of, I think is key in that one.
Yeah, brilliant, great advice. And when this crisis is over, do you foresee rehiring or the recruitment side of things being challenging, just because of the number of people that might be going for positions? What's your thoughts on that?
I often hear, I'm sure everyone does hear these sort of news articles that focus on an individual, and that individual says, well, you know what, I've applied for 1,000 jobs and I've not heard anything. My reaction to that often is, well, you've applied for 1,000 jobs. Most of them are probably inappropriate jobs. My view is to it's quality over quantity every single day of the week. So if you do apply for roles, then make sure that you're giving yourself the edge over the other applicants that potentially will be applying for that role. I'll give you an example. So we've recently been looking for a new account manager in our London office. We've had so our ad says very clearly, HR experience, account management experience, and a London base primarily. We've had beauticians from Rochdale. We've had forestry workers from Cumbria. we've had all sorts of people that apply, and of course, unfortunately, when the applications run into the hundreds and in some cases the thousands, we're a small business, we're unable to respond in those cases. So I would absolutely say to people, the economy is fairly resilient. It always will be. I'm a great believer in that. And yes, it will bounce back, and it will bounce back quite quickly, I think, once this whole COVID episode, unfortunately, is over. Those organizations, again, that have taken care with how they've communicated and how they've treated their workers in times of difficulty will typically be those organizations that are seen as employers of choice. So they will have an easier time potentially attracting employees to come and work for them. We still live in largely a sort of a shortage of talent driven market. So this sort of war for talent that McKinsey talked about 10 or 12 years ago, or 15 years ago now, is still very much in evidence, and helping people understand what that looks like, and how they can capitalize on talent when they come to recruit, or how organizations can capitalize on talent when they come to recruit. People have long memories, so how they're treated now will determine their view of that organization in the long term. We talk about boomerang employees now, certainly for some of the sort of the retail sector and the hospitality sector. Boomerang employees, they'll work for an organization for a period of time, and then they'll come back 2, 3, 4 years later. If they've had a good experience. If they've had a poor experience, they won't come back. Undoubtedly, it's a more challenging time in the job market at the moment, and people will have to be flexible when they look at their skills and capabilities. But there are jobs out there, and for motivated individuals who have a good track record, so to speak, it's possibly not as grim as it's initially made out to be.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's something that I hadn't really considered before listening to you, Owen, that it's not just about the conversation with the individual and how that affects the individual that you're talking to. It's that wider implication of what does that say about us as a business, and what does that say about us as a brand, and who we are as people. And I think that hopefully everyone listening will have that in the back of their mind. I think just one last question to finish up on. What's the one piece of advice that you would give to someone that's never done this before, and they know they've got that first conversation coming up soon?
Probably a couple of, I'm probably going to use that as a cue to give you a couple of pieces of advice. Don't be afraid of it. I mean, it's nothing to, it is part and parcel of a managerial conversation, or a business owner's conversation. Most of us will have to go through that unfortunate episode at some point in our working lives. So certainly don't be afraid of it. Having said that, you can minimize the impact on the individual by looking at some of the pointers I've hopefully given today. I'm a great believer in practice makes perfect. So if you do have a script, be comfortable with it. Don't give the appearance that you're looking at that script for the first time when you're sitting face to face with someone who you're having to let go. So be prepared, be planned, be as comfortable as you can be. Try and create that environment where you can put people at ease. It's not easy, but it can be done if you work at it and you try and think through how best to deliver that news. And again, some of the tips that I've given hopefully will be of value.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Owen. I think that's the last of our questions. So that just really leaves me to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. This session has been recorded and it will be up on our website shortly. And for anyone that wants to carry on the conversation with Owen, we will send you an email with his contact details so that you can get in touch and carry on that conversation and seek his advice and support. So to our members and our guests, thank you very much for logging in and being with us today. We've got a lot more events out there to help you, so just keep an eye on our newsletters that come through and any emails from me and the rest of the team. And just feel free to get in touch with us at any time. Let us know how we can support you and your business. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. So stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.